And good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for the NVMe and NVMe over Fabrics Plugfest number 9 webinar. My name is Carrie Munson. I will be your presenter today. Joining me will also be David Wolf, Senior Engineer for Data Center Technologies. So a little bit about who we are. The University of New Hampshire Interoperability Lab is located in Durham, New Hampshire. The university was founded in 1866, and the school has approximately 12,500 undergrad students and 2,500 grad students. The IOL is a neutral third-party lab that works with a variety of different technologies ranging from data center, broadband, and a variety of Ethernet technologies. We have been involved with the NVMe org since 2012, and in 2013 we hosted our first Plugfest. Now we will be hosting our 9th Plugfest 6 years later, so that's pretty exciting for us. And not just one, but we will be hosting 3 separate events this summer. The first of which will take place the week of June 11th through the 14th. And that will be the traditional SSD-based Plugfest, where we will be testing for version 9.0 of the new test plan. The following week, we'll be hosting our NVMe over Fabrics Plugfest, and we will be posting products on our Fabrics Integrators list, which was launched last year. So registration for both those events are open right now. Please, if you have not already, feel free to register. If you have any questions about that, feel free to contact me. I want to draw extra attention to the 3rd event here, NVMe Plugfest, taking place in Wuhan, China. This will be our first Plugfest event that we will be doing off-site. Registration for this event is now open, and if we do get enough interest, we will be moving forward with this event. And that will take place the week of July 23rd through 26th. And again, if you have any questions about this event, please feel free to contact me. All right, so just a quick look. These are the number of tests that are offered for each of the different test services, all the way from NVMe Conformance all the way through the Fabrics. We have a glossary right here of some common terms that you will see throughout this presentation as well as in our test plan. We've also attached some figures to go along with some of the slides, so you'll be more familiar with what the slides are being directed towards. So with that, I am going to hand the presentation over to David Wolf.
Thanks, Carrie. So here are the things that we're going to be addressing to help you folks prepare for the Plugfest. First, test tool updates, helping you know what's changed there and get ready, run those tools in your in-house lab, weed out any bugs with those. We'll be going through with that. Next, we'll be talking about updates and test requirement updates for SSDs, for products that support NVMe-MI, and then also NVMe-oF products. And then at the end, we'll hand it back to Carrie to talk about some of the logistics with preparing for the event and traveling to our facility here in New Hampshire. So first off, I'd like to spend a little bit of time to talk about just the numbering of the Plugfest and the numbering of the tools and the test plan, just to make sure that we're clear on that. And so, as Carrie mentioned, this is going to be the 9th Plugfest. And basically, we do these major updates to the test requirements, to the test plans, to the test tools, roughly twice a year, and it always coincides with a Plugfest. And so that's where you see that major change. So our last Plugfest was Plugfest number 8, and our test plan version was version number 8. So this June, we're doing Plugfest number 9, and we're using test plan 9.0, and our tools have been updated to 9.0. There are some minor updates which only affect the tools that we do on a much more regular cadence. Every few weeks, we'll do a release of the tools, and you'll see those denoted as a 9.0A or 9.0B. And in those minor releases, we may add some FYI test functionality. We may introduce new usability features, but really the mandatory tests and the requirements are not changed. So just to give you an idea of what's changing with a major release, such as an 8 to a 9, versus what's changing with a minor release, such as a 9.0A to a 9.0B. So a quick review on the tools that we do have available. I think many of you are familiar with the UNH-IOL PC Edition Interact test tool. And there's different versions of that available for PCIe, for Rocky, and also for Fiber Channel. We also have software that supports the Teledyne LaCroix tools for PCIe. For all of those tools, we have released version 9.0A, and depending on bug fixes and other releases that we do to address any bugs that are found with that, we'll be using version 9.0A or higher at Plugfest number 9. So if you're planning on attending Plugfest number 9, we highly recommend start using version 9.0A of our test software for whichever tool you happen to be using, whether it be for PCIe or Rocky or Fiber Channel. There is the 8.0 tools that are available. Those are things we've addressed with bug fixes to the previous test plan. If you do happen to be looking to list a product on the 8.0 integrators list, that tool is still available. But all of the new bug fixes and new test capability is in the 9.0 tool. So again, if you're looking to attend this Plugfest in June or the one in July, if you're looking to list a product on the 9.0 integrators list, we really recommend using those 9.0 tools. So here's that again. The NVMe Conformance, both across PCIe and across Fabric, is in our PC edition. We have some PCIe tests available in Teledyne LaCroix tool as well. For NVMe-MI Conformance, this is one we get a fair amount of questions on. All of those tests are implemented with the Teledyne LaCroix T34 today. And so at the Plugfest, we're going to be using the software version 8.76. So again, if you're trying to prep for NVMe-MI, you want to make sure you're using the software 8.76 from LaCroix. So a little bit on tracking bugs that get reported in the tools. We know that right now, lots of folks are downloading the tools, lots of folks are running them in their lab and testing them out. And so naturally, there's a little bit of a bump in the number of questions we get and support calls that we're handling. And sometimes folks, of course, do find bugs. And so one thing you might have noticed if you've been using our tools lately, when you report a bug, we'll reply back with a bug number that we've assigned to it. And when we do a subsequent release, that release will include all of the bugs with those assigned bug numbers that are addressed in that release. And so we hope that that will help you to make a connection between the bugs that you reported and maybe things that you saw when testing against your product and things that we've addressed in a specific release. And so if you look at the release notes for the 9.0A tool, you'll see all of the fixes have a number assigned to them, and certainly we'll be keeping that up for the subsequent minor releases, 9.0B, 9.0C, and so forth. So we hope that that just helps people track those fixes a little bit easier. So that's it for updates with regard to the tools. What I'd like to talk about now are actual changes to the test requirements and some changes about some tests moving from FYI to mandatory, and then also a number of new FYI test cases. That's a regular feature when we do these major releases at a Plugfest. We'll introduce a lot more new FYI test capability we want to continue to evolve the test program and increase its coverage, improve the test program, and so forth. So we cycle those tests through a period of being FYI tests before we make them mandatory. So I'll go into some detail on what those are. So specifically with respect to the PCIe tests for SSDs, we ask that folks test with both the PC edition and the LaCroix edition. And if a product passes on both of those, there's no further review is necessary. When we run these at the Plugfest, they both take about 30 minutes to run when everything works well. We know that there's gotchas now and again, but generally when things are running smoothly, those tests take about 30 minutes to run. And we have posted the latest versions of the test plans for these on our website. You'll see both a clean version and a redline version. That redline version will show you the changes from 8.0, from the 8.0 plan. So if perchance the last time you tested with us was in Plugfest number 8 in October of 2017, and you want to see the changes between Plugfest number 8 and Plugfest number 9, you can take a look at the redline version and you'll see those called out. Some of those changes are clarifications to test procedures. Some of those changes are changing the requirements around a test, making them FYI or mandatory, and some are new test cases. So first I'll just step through all of the test cases that are changed from FYI to mandatory at this Plugfest number 9. And I'll say that all of these tests were previously FYI. We never introduced new tests that are mandatory right off the bat. We introduced them at a Plugfest as FYI tests. And then after the Plugfest, the NVMe Interop and Compliance Committee reviews those tests, reviews the results of those tests to see if this test is mature enough, if it's robust enough to make it a mandatory requirement, and also looking at how well that test is supported. How many products are supporting the features that that test is looking at the Plugfest. So just to give you a little bit of insight into that process about how a test goes from FYI to mandatory. So a fair number of tests this time were made mandatory. We've got some new subcases in test 1.4 about I/O submission and completion queues. So added a case there, case number 10. We had a case number 1 in test 1.7, asynchronous events, that was made mandatory. And then 3 new cases around the dataset management command. Case where we deallocate an outer range field, case where we set the NR value to a maximum value, and another case, case 5, where we check that a correct range is deallocated. Again, all of these tests were run FYI at Plugfest number 8 and are made mandatory for Plugfest number 9. Continuing that, new test cases under the read and write commands, those are tests 2.3 and 2.4. We added cases to both of those where we use an invalid PRP address offset. We added a check to test 2.7 case 9, where we set the PR check field to a non-zero value. Case 2 in test 2.9 also made mandatory. This checks some requirements around atomic boundaries. And then finally, at test 5.5 case 6, we have a test case added where if a feature is not namespace specific and the IV or interrupt vector field is set to 1, that was set to be mandatory. So those are all of the NVMe conformance tests that apply to SSDs that have changed from FYI to mandatory. Now we're going to talk about some new conformance test cases that are, of course, all FYI because they're new test cases. But these are things that we'll be running at this event for the first time. And a lot of these are based on capability that is defined in the NVMe version 1.3 specification. So that's kind of the basis for these test cases. So first, some new test cases around the telemetry log pages. This is adding some new test cases under the get log page test. And then we have a number of new test cases around device self-test. So test 1.10, 1.11, 1.12, and 1.13 test device self-test short operation, device self-test extended operation, and then aborting those operations. And so some new test cases there. Other new test cases, we added a test case to the test 1.1, the identify test case, for checking the namespace identification descriptor. So that was something that was new for NVMe 1.3. We added the timestamp feature as one of the features to be checked in the set-get feature test. That's test 1.2. And then a number of new tests in section 8 of our test plan. A lot of section 8 has to do with power states. And so returning from a non-operation state, exit and entrance latency for those power states, and then also relative read and write throughput when in those power states. So those were all some new test cases that have been added. Again, all based on things that were introduced in version 1.3 of the NVMe specification. And again, all of the new test cases are FYI at this first Plugfest they're being performed at. A couple other things that you'll see if you take a look at that red line document. In the NVMe 1.3 specification, the requirements around how to report error codes were loosened a little bit. So there was a number of test cases that used to check that errors were reported in the correct error, that they were reported in numerical error. In NVMe 1.3, that is no longer a requirement, and so we adjusted the tests for that. And also we added some further checks to ensure that the features being tested are actually supported by the drives. And so again, you'll see a number of places in the test plan document in that red line where we call that out, where we check perhaps a register value or check something like the OHCS field or the ONCS field, just to make sure that a feature is actually supported before we go ahead and execute a test. And if it's not supported, now we just skip that test. So those are the changes to the NVMe conformance requirements. A little bit on NVMe interop requirements. So really no change on the interop test requirements. We still do the I/O test and the hot plug test as usual. If you're interested in replicating those tests in your own lab, we've posted our MLTT scripts up on our box file share, so you can download those and run them just as we will be doing at the Plugfest. The interop testing, take note of it. It does take about 90 minutes to do the interop test. And the reason for that is we do a number of course, there's the I/O, which takes a couple minutes to run. But the thing that takes up a lot of time with the interop testing is the cycles of shutdown of the server system and reboot of the server system can take some time. But that is one of the requirements of the test plan. So be aware of that going into the event. That's one that sometimes we can get a little bit of a squeeze on. We have not had any problems with people not being able to get their testing done during the Plugfest. I want to say that at the outset. Although be aware the scheduling for this can be a little bit tight. As far as new FYI test cases for the interop, we've introduced a test on return from hibernation. So there are some tests that do a full reboot and do a full shutdown. This is a little different, where we put the system into a hibernation mode and cycle it several times and make sure that the drive stays active and is able to come back from each hibernation. Again, this is an FYI test, so not required at this time. But depending on how it goes at Plugfest number 9, it may become a requirement at Plugfest number 10. We'll determine that after this event and after further review. I saw there was some questions that came in about in the Q&A about the interop systems that we were going to use. So here's the list of systems that we're planning to use at the Plugfest. These are all the host systems and root complexes that we're planning to use. This is also posted on our website, our NVMe equipment list. The link is there at the bottom of this slide. But these are the systems that we're going to be using for the Interop systems. Many of them are probably familiar if you've attended a Plugfest before, but we do have 2 new systems this time around. First, the AMD EPIC system. That actually has a gigabyte motherboard that we'll be using. So that's exciting to be able to test against the new root complex. And then also the Dell PowerEdge R740 XT server. So this is a new server that we've added to our interop test bed. And again, all this is posted up on our website. Keep in mind the requirements around the interop testing have not changed. We have, let's see, 6, 8, 10, 11 systems available for interop testing. when testing an SSD for the integrators list, it's only required to pass with five of the systems. So again, people don't usually run into too much trouble there, but there's lots of systems to test against. And again, we look for folks to pass against 5 of those systems. So those are the updates with respect to NVMe Conformance and NVMe Interop. Now we're going to talk a little bit about NVMe-MI. Now, at the moment, there are only conformance tests defined for NVMe-MI. And we perform those using the Teledyne LaCroix T34. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we're using software version 8.76 at the Plugfest. So if you're interested in trying that out ahead of the event, you'll need to talk to LaCroix about that and getting that software in-house. But one thing we're going to try at this event, which is purely a proof of concept, is NVMe-MI Interop. So that last system that we had shown in our list of Interop systems, that Dell R740XD, is a system that supports NVMe-MI natively. And so we're going to be using that as a kind of proof of concept for trying out some NVMe-MI Interop tests. None of those tests are required. They don't have any bearing on qualifying a device for the integrators list, but we're going to use that proof of concept as at least some information gathering, some fact finding, if you will, on ways to add NVMe-MI Interop to our program in the future. Another thing to pay attention to with respect to both the NVMe and NVMe-MI integrators lists, we treat those as completely separate lists. So you do not need to list a product on one of those lists in order to qualify for the other. They have their own independent qualification. As far as things that have changed with respect to NVMe-MI Conformance, there were 2 tests that were FYI at Plugfest number 8 that have been made mandatory for Plugfest number 9. Those are tests 4.10 about invalid command size and test 5.3 around CRC check. So pay a little bit of attention to those. The mechanics of those tests have not changed, so we don't expect that to cause an issue for anyone. Again, we were sure to review those before making them mandatory in the Interop and Compliance Committee. But those are the test requirement changes there. So that's it for NVMe. Like I said, just a couple changes on the conformance test, and then we're going to do that proof of concept test for NVMe-MI Interop. And like I said, that's an experiment. We'll see where it takes us, and maybe we'll be adding NVMe-MI Interop to a future event. So our next step will be NVMe over Fabrics. And so there's been a lot of interest in NVMe over Fabrics. We did our first kind of official event for NVMe over Fabrics back in the fall. And so we've got some updates to the requirements there. Now, one thing to keep in mind about the NVMe-oF integrators list, it accepts several different types of products. So we have Rocky initiators and targets, Ethernet switches, and of course, fiber channel initiators, targets, and switches as products that we currently accept to the NVMe-oF integrators list. I expect that in the future, there may be new types of products that will be added to that program. A lot of people have asked about InfiniBand, people have asked about iWarp, people have asked about NVMe over TCP. Now, those are certainly candidates to get added in the future, but of course, each of those we would want to address with a proof of concept or with a set of FYI tests first. So, but for this event, the products that we're focused on are primarily Rocky and fiber channel products. And of course, all that's documented in the integrators list policy document, which is also updated for version 9.0 and posted on our website for folks who are interested in reading more of the details on that. So the requirements for getting a product up onto the NVMe-oF integrators list, we have the Interop tests, which have to be performed with basically 2 Interop partners. And then also for targets or for NVMe-oF NVM subsystems, as the NVMe specification refers to them, there are a set of conformance tests that are required as well. And those conformance tests are NVMe conformance tests performed over Fabrics. And so if you were to go through the NVMe conformance test document, you would see that a number of tests are flagged with an OF in the title. And that means that they can be performed for Fabrics and applied to Fabrics. So if you're testing a Fabrics device and looking through the test plan, trying to figure out which ones apply to you, look for the ones that have the OF designation. You'll see a number of tests that have the OF FYI designation. That means that they may apply to Fabrics in the future, but right now they're just FYI. And in a couple slides, I'll get to exactly what tests have been made, what conformance tests have been made mandatory for Fabrics. But first, I want to just show people a little bit of the test setup that we'll be using for NVMe-oF Interop, and then we'll get into the test setup and tools for NVMe-oF Conformance. So our setup for the NVMe-oF Interop test is fairly straightforward. We'll have a server with either a RNIC or fiber channel HBA in it, depending on which transport you're using. We'll put that through 2 switches and connect that to our NVMe-oF target or NVMe-oF NVM subsystem. And we have a fairly straightforward set of interop tests. First, discover the target, send I/O to the target, do a link pull at various places in the fabric, and then a couple power-up tests where we power up the target, power up the server, power up the switches. So there's more detail on those in the Interop test suite document. There's a link to that here on this slide if you want to see the exact step-by-step process that we use for that. But at a high level, it's discover the target, do I/O, do link pulls, make sure that the target is rediscovered, and then do some power up and power down cycles and make sure the target is rediscovered. As far as the actual hardware that we use for those NVMe-oF Interop tests, we've documented that here, and it's similar to the setup that we used last time. On the initiator side, we've got a Mellanox Connect X4, 100 gig RNIC. We've got 200 gig edge core switches in between, and then a Mellanox Connect X4 RNIC acting as a target in another system. And really, whatever type of product you're testing, whether it be an initiator, whether it be a target, whether it be a switch, whether it be a NIC acting as a host or NIC acting as a target, we can substitute that into any spot in this interop setup in order to perform those interoperability tests. Very similar setup for fiber channel, except instead of RNICs, we've got fiber channel HBAs. Instead of 100 gig Ethernet switches, we've got some 32 gig fiber channel switches. So on each end of the link, we've got a HP Store Fabric HBA acting as both an initiator and target at each end, and then we've got some Brocade G620 switches in the middle. And again, if you're testing a fiber channel product, depending on if it's initiator, target, or switch, it can be substituted into any place in this particular interop setup in order to perform those tests. So that gives you an idea of what we're doing for NVMe over Fabrics interop testing. Now we'll kind of shift gears and talk about NVMe-oF conformance testing. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the tools for this are posted and available. If you're doing NVMe-oF testing, we'd highly encourage you to go download the PC edition of our tool for either fiber channel or Rocky. And keep in mind that the purpose of that tool is essentially to act as an NVMe-oF initiator and exercise some NVMe functionality on the target. That's kind of the mindset that tool uses. And so you'll see that the setup for that, for the conformance tests, is really almost identical to the setup that we use for interop tests. So UNH-IOL will be providing a server that has the appropriate RNIC in it and has our software installed on it. And then we'll be testing the targets through a set of switches. And so if you have an NVMe-oF target that's going through conformance testing, your product would sit kind of on the right of this diagram. So we would have this kind of turquoise colored cylinder here. That's where your product would sit in the setup for conformance testing. And again, very similar for fiber channel, just the hardware is a little bit different. But again, UNH-IOL will provide the system that houses the initiator side, and UNH-IOL will provide the switches, and the conformance testing will be performed on your target, which again would be on the right side of this diagram. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but just to give you a picture of what it looks like, the tests that apply to Fabrics, we've flagged in the test plan with this OF designation. So as you're paging through that, you'll see that those are the ones that apply to Fabrics. Not every test in the test plan applies to fabrics. It's about 60% that we've identified as applying to fabrics. And keep in mind that today this is only checking the NVMe protocol. There are not any tests yet that are validating the binding specification. So as far as NVMe tests that are being made mandatory on the conformance side for fabrics, test 1.1, case 1 and 2. So this is pretty basic functionality for the identify command for the namespace data structure and the controller data structure. Test 1.3, case 1 and 2, this is around the get log page command. Test 1.7, case 2, also made mandatory for fabrics products. And then all the cases in test 2.5. And you'll see test 2.5 is the write uncorrectable command. So one thing I'll mention about that, the write uncorrectable command is of course an optional feature in the NVMe specification. So the stance we take on that is if you implement this feature, you must implement it correctly. But if you do not implement the feature, we simply don't do the test, we skip the test. So while that test is flagged as mandatory, of course, it only gets performed on products that actually support that write uncorrectable feature. And if products don't support that feature, the test is skipped and it doesn't have any impact on integrators list testing. So that of course applies to all of the conformance tests, but I thought I'd point that out about the write uncorrectable command, since that's one we get a lot of questions about that on. A couple other fabrics tests that are being made mandatory this time around. Test 2.6, flush command case 2, we've made that one mandatory. Test 2.8, some things about atomicity parameters, some power management test cases, and then test 5.1, page-based address and offset, also recommended to be mandatory this time around. So those are the NVMe conformance tests that we've made mandatory for this Plugfest, for Plugfest number 9. We're really hoping that at Plugfest number 9, a bunch more tests we'll see some good support for, and we'll be able to make those mandatory for Plugfest number 10. But that's something that we can worry about a few months down the road. A couple other things to pay attention to with respect to fabrics. One thing we're going to try is a proof of concept on large build. So if you've attended some other fabrics Plugfest hosted by other forums in the past, and even some hosted here at UNH-IOL, there's always a lot of interest in doing a large build, connecting as many products as possible and checking the robustness of that. And so if we have enough products here, that's something that we're going to try and do as a proof of concept, purely an experimental test, not a requirement, does not have any bearing on integrators list testing, but does provide us an opportunity to maybe find some bugs that our regular interop tests or regular conformance tests might miss. So we're going to try that as a proof of concept test. And then also there's been some requests for trying out an InfiniBand proof of concept. We're open to doing that as well. Our only kind of bar for that is there needs to be enough products at the event supporting that. So I think we're looking for maybe 2 or 3 products supporting InfiniBand in order to do a full proof of concept for that. So if you're listening to this and interested in testing InfiniBand and want to see if there's enough interest brewing, feel free to reach out to us directly and see if we've heard from anyone else about that. And if there is interest, we'll certainly be happy to host a proof of concept at this event. So that's it for updates with respect to the tools and the test suites and so forth. So now we'll hand it back to Carrie to talk about the logistics for the event, help you prepare anything for travel and getting your equipment here and just being ready as possible. So we'll hand it back to Carrie.
All right, thank you, David. I've noticed a few questions have come in throughout the presentation. David will be collecting these at the end and answering them. So please take this time while we're reviewing the logistics if you have any questions. All right, so first off, be prepared. If your device requires any special cabling, any power, anything whatsoever, please make sure that you bring it with you. The PC Flex is a common tool that many people do need, and some people have not had in the past, and we've only had a limited amount. Download the latest test tools and run them. They are available through our UNH box file share. I can provide you with the login to access both of those. This is separate from the My IOL. Bring 2 samples of each of your products, minimum. If you are able to bring more, that's helpful, especially if they're working properly or if there happens to be an open test slot that we can fit you in. Yep, so again, we do have some adapters on hand. If you do have any extra, please feel free to bring those along with you. We have things like mice and keyboards available. We have conference rooms if you need to take calls or have a meeting. There is a soldering station if your product needs to be fixed or reworked. We have wireless access that we will provide to everybody on your first day. Those come along with your name badge. No photos, please. Just be respectful to everyone that is here. Everyone is under an NDA. We will be taking generic photos of the lab. So if you do see somebody with a camera, let me know. Chances are it might be one of our IOL staff, but it's better to be safe. If you would like a photo taken of your team or your own product, let us know and we can happily help you out with that. So here's a look at some of the travel information, the shipping address. Your equipment should arrive the Thursday before the event. So if you are participating in the PCI event, have the products delivered to us by June 7th. And if you are attending the Fabrics event, we ask for about June 13th or 14th. Here's a map of the parking area. We will have parking available for you in the Mill Road parking lot. This is at the bottom of the screen in blue. We'll provide a code the week before the event that you can punch into the parking meter, and parking will be free for you for that week. If you do not get the parking code, please let me know and I'll get that for you. My favorite part right here, we will be doing our social at the UNH football stadium. Usually every Wednesday during the NVMe Plugfest, we hold a social event, kind of a chance for people to relax, have some good food, and enjoy ourselves after a long week. So we're switching up the location for this event, and it should be a great time. So here's the link to the registration. And again, registration closes on May 21st. There is a limit of 2 products per company. Additional products will be placed on a waiting list, and I can assist you with that. I will have a better idea of how many products are available from the waiting list to be added to the schedule, probably 2 weeks before the event. So I will touch base with you about that if you do have additional products. There's 4 engineers per company. However, if you do want to bring additional engineers, let me know and I'll work with you on that. All right, and finally, if you have any questions about any of the test cases, upcoming, current, please feel free to join the ICC calls. They occur Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. Right now, actually, they would probably be taking place. All right, so I will hand it back over to David, and he will answer any questions that have come in.
All right, thanks, Carrie. Yeah, we have a number of questions that have come in, and so I'll step through these, and certainly if there are questions out there, go ahead and enter those in through the Q&A box in the webinar viewer. So the first question was about some details about the host platforms that we're going to use in the Plugfest. And this came in pretty early in the presentation, and we did share some of that information on the slide, but I understand it's useful for people to know the motherboard, make, model, BIOS, OS, and so forth that we'll be using. So that is in the slides, but also we've posted it on our website, on our equipment list. So, and that link is in the slides. So go ahead and check that out. We do try and be as detailed as we can there. We do include the information about the BIOS that we have on the motherboard and so forth. So you'll find that there. And those are the systems that we'll use. I know a lot of people like to try and replicate some of the systems in their lab and try things out ahead of time. So let us know if you have questions about a specific system, but that information is up there. We had a couple of questions about whether slides would be available after the webinar. Yes, we'll send the slides to all the registered attendees. Similarly, we can provide a recording as well. We had a couple of questions about the registration page. I think it was one of the last slides there that Carrie shared had the link to the registration page on it, so you can look there. The other thing that's pretty easy to do is if you go to our main page, iol.unh.edu, and look under events, you'll see these events, these Plugfests listed pretty prominently, and you can get to the registration page pretty easily from there. We had a question about open bugs for tools and if folks can see the list of open bugs for the tools. We don't have a way to share that easily with people right now. We just have a way to publish the ones that are closed. So if a bug has been reported and you don't see it in the release notes, of course you can clearly assume that it's still open. We may look into a way of sharing that in the future. We do have some known issues around usability that we put into the release notes, but as far as NVMe spec or test related issues, we don't have a good way to share those at the moment. So we had a question about a link to the bug reporting tool. That is, you can find that under your My IOL login. So again, if you go to our page and log in, any representative of a member company can get a login, and we have a walkthrough there where you can report a bug in any of our tools. So if you go to My IOL linked on our page, you can find that. We had a question about where to get the MLTT scripts for doing those I/O tests. We've shared those on our box file share. So if you're having trouble finding that, of course, reach out to us directly, but those are up on our box file share for you to try out and use. We had a question about DCBX and whether that's required to be configured for the fabrics test. The answer is no, but I'll provide a little more detail there. So when we set up the fabrics test, we've got a single initiator, a single target, and a pretty simple fabric of 2 switches. And so we're not really stressing that fabric or anything. We're not causing any kind of congestion. So we don't require DCBX to be configured as part of that. Now, UNH-IOL has some other services where we check out DCBX testing and go through that in more detail. For the purpose of this event, it's not required. However, as an information gathering thing, depending on time, that might be something that we can try out. after running through the tests, we can run them again with DCBX configured and see if that works. So that could be an interesting proof of concept to do, but again, not part of the integrators list qualification. And just a little bit more on that, our focus for this event, of course, is NVMe protocol and making sure that that is working properly. And the DCBX is basically there's other services and test events that handle that, but it could be interesting to try that out if we have time available. So, we had a question about if someone has just an HBA card that they want to use either as an initiator or target, could they bring that and plug it into a server at the IOL? To be honest, we'd really like to avoid doing that for a couple reasons. One, and probably the primary one, is if you have a server in your lab that you know and trust, and you've configured properly for using with your particular card, we'd really recommend that you bring that so that in this test event, we're not maybe chasing some other problem or some other configuration issue between your HBA and some server that we've provided. We'd really rather just focus on the NVMe test. So if at all possible, we'd really recommend that you bring a server that you've configured and had working in your lab, rather than trying to rebuild a system when you get here to UNH-IOL. If that's absolutely impossible for one reason or another, of course, we want to support you guys and work with you on it. But for the purpose of making it easy for everyone and making sure that we focus on the NVMe testing, we'd recommend you bring your own server system. Someone asked if we would be performing host-related testing or only drive-related. It's true that our conformance tests fully focus on testing the conformance of the drive, and the host testing is really reserved for interoperability testing. And so I guess I can take a step back and for listing hosts on any of the integrators list, the NVMe integrators list, as well as the NVMe-oF integrators list, the only requirement for listing a host there is the interoperability test. There's not conformance requirements today on listing a host on that system. So the conformance testing again focuses on the drive. Interoperability testing obviously applies to both. We had a question on whether we've run our test tool on an ARM server running CentOS, and no, I have not tried that yet. We've had a few folks asking it. I think that's something that we may try again to support in the future. There's no obvious roadblocks there, since we're using there's no obvious roadblocks to using our software in an ARM system. I'd be very interested to hear if people have tried that out and what kind of issues they've run into, or if they've had success. But at the moment, we're sticking to kind of the regular Intel system for performing those PC edition tests. Now, speaking of ARM, I think that's an interesting system that in the future we may look into adding some ARM systems to our Interop test bed. But it looked like this question was more aimed at conformance. So we have not tried conformance using an ARM system, but I think there's a lot of interest in trying some Interop with an ARM system. And then I guess there's some more questions on the PC test. Is this run on one particular system? Yes, we will have a system at UNH-IOL during the Plugfest that will be offering the PC edition tests on. I don't have the specifics for that system in front of me, but with the ARM question aside, we've seen that software runs pretty well on most most systems with Intel PCIe chipset in them. So shouldn't be hard to find systems that work with that. And last question here about so a list of interested companies for each section of testing. usually what we'll do ahead of this is a good question, because I understand the event has more value when there's more people attending, especially on the interoperability front, and also if you know if the attendees are going to be people that you've tested with before or not. So usually what we do, we try and do it at least 3 weeks before the event, is publish a schedule for people to see who their potential interop partners are. So registration, at least for the PCIe event, is closing in late May, and then a week after that is the one for the Fabrics event. And basically, as soon as that registration closes, we get to work on putting a schedule together, and usually just a couple days after registration closes, we're able to get a draft schedule out to folks. And so you'll see who else is attending the event and who your potential interop partners are. So we do try and get that out pretty early. There was a question about NVMe-MI Conformance and other test tools available for doing that, and how we can add test tools for that. For that, I would say the best thing to do there is raise that at the Interop and Compliance Committee. As we mentioned, those calls are every other Tuesday. So that would probably be the best place for that question, to see if there's interest in expanding the number of tools that support the NVMe-MI testing. Let's see, and one other question here. So we'll answer this question, and if there's time for one more, we'll try and grab that. There's a question about automation for the interop testing. We have automated some of our interop tests, particularly the shutdown and reboot tests, to make sure that those kind of happen relatively smoothly. From a device perspective, for an SSD, there's probably not a lot of need for you, the testing company, to provide any automation. But like I said, we've done some automation here on our host systems to automate that IO generation and automate the shutdown and reboot cycles. So that is all the questions that we have time for, and I think we addressed every single one. So thank you for folks that put in questions. There's some good ones in there. And certainly if anything else crops up, feel free to reach out to Carrie or myself about that if you have a specific question. But with that, we'll hand it back to Carrie for just some final comments.
Thank you, David. And thank you all for attending today's webinar covering the NVMe and NVMe Plugfest, which will be taking place next June, as well as NVMe Plugfest number 9 in Wuhan, China this July. We appreciate your time, and if you have any further questions, please feel free to contact us. Just a reminder, this recording will be posted on our website and on YouTube. So on behalf of the UNH-IOL, thank you again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.